can start now, have we? Yeah. I stopped
okay.
sharing the screen now, so
Okay.
Over to you, David.
So can people see me now? Am I viewable? Because all I'm doing is seeing you. Okay.
Yes, you are.
All right,
Yeah.
cool. Okay, right. Okay. Oh, I see. This is what you can see. Yeah. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second session at this extraordinary meeting, which I'm so looking forward to it. I'm in this lion's den with all these journalists surrounding me, not a single statistician to look after me. So, but anyway, I don't care. I can cope. I can deal with it. I've suffered enough over the last 6 months. So it gives me great pleasure to try to referee this session over the next 90 minutes. And so before my name's David Spiegelhalter. I'm chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication and various other things, co-chair of the Royal Statistical Society COVID Task Force, and so on. Oh, conflict of interest. If we've got any conflicts of interest, I'm I'm now a non-executive director of the UK Statistics Authority, which is the body that looks over Office for National Statistics and Office for Statistics Regulation. So, of course, I'm only going to say nice things about them. So what I'd like to do then is just go through the panel and then just to introduce themselves and say who they are. And then we're all going to get 5 or 10 minutes each to do our little bit. And then we're going to open up for questions and discussion, which I think should be quite interesting. So can we pass over to Stuart? Could you start?
I am Stuart Allen. I'm a professor of journalism and communication in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University.
Thanks so much. Paul.
Hello, I'm the course leader for the MA in Data Journalism at Birmingham City University, and I also work as a data journalist with the BBC Data Unit and work with other organisations as well.
You're a bit quiet for me, Paul. I don't know if anybody else is right. So maybe, I mean, I'm old, it's my hearing as well.
I'll see if I can get a microphone. And see if
that sounds a bit better already. Tom.
Hello, hi, I'm Tom Chivers. I'm a freelance science writer, and I'm science editor at the magazine website Unheard.
Pamela.
Yeah, I'm Pamela Duncan, and I am one of the Guardian's data project team, and more recently a coronavirus death expert.
Oh, just what we need. Great. Jane.
Hello, I'm Jane Kirby. I'm health editor at PA Media. I've worked at PA all of my career, 20 years, and I've been covering health for about 15.
Okay. Thank you all so much for that. So we're going to come back to you, and you can do your bit. I'm going to start off by giving my angle, which is be completely from a statistical point of view. So I'm going to try to share my screen. And I might use a video clip. We're going to have some sound, and so this is what I hope you can see now. A statistician's experience. I was going to call it a punter's experience, because the crucial thing is that I've been doing quite a lot of this stuff and dealing with the sort of people that are now in front of the panel. I should just say, I'm chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication. That's the team. That was a recent Zoom meeting we had. That's what we do all the time, cheer ourselves up. But we've been, as you heard in Kevin's talk, we've also been doing, apart from the media work, I've been doing a lot of actual research on the communication of risks and uncertainty. Okay, so it's been a busy time. I think that actually the people on the ground getting the data out, Public Health England and ONS and others have done a fantastic job. The government communication has been another matter, but I think the people actually doing the work have done a great job. Of course, I would say that because of my conflict of interest, but I do really believe it. It's been an extraordinary time, as Kevin has already mentioned, being a sort of statistician, quotes, expert, because of the demands. I mean, normally I would think, oh, wow, if I got a slot on Newsnight, it'd be just a red letter down. I'd go down to London, I'd all be excited. But, now I'm just turning them down all the time, just because I can't be bothered to be sober at 11:15 in the evening. Science Media Centre, I've got to mention them, have been a complete star. Amazing amount of work. I just cannot believe the work they've done, both in terms of the briefings, the announcements, extraordinary performance, and also just in terms of the absolute daily grind of commenting on papers. And as Kevin mentioned, things like commenting on press released preprints, which a year ago would have been completely unthinkable as a practice. My experience of journalists has been they work very well indeed. I've had a very good relationships with journalists on the whole. I'll talk about some perhaps slightly more tricky things, but no, on the whole, they've been very good. But just a general issue about being a statistician in this thing is very difficult to remain non-aligned. You know, as the arguments get polarized, there's constant demands to take one side or another. And the other thing is constant demands to go outside actually what you know about. So I've just, you know, I think everybody involved in this as a punter, as a performer, has had to learn just to keep your mouth shut when asked about stuff you really don't want to comment on. I should say, Kevin and I have been working on a sort of list, because we want to actually sort of teach statisticians. This is the first outing of it. We're going to test it out. A list of points for statisticians dealing with in situations like this. And I'm not going to go all through these, nothing more tedious than going through a list. You can look through some of these. I'll just mention some of them. I've already mentioned, don't be lured out of your comfort zone. I've had, you know, real performances. So Nick Robinson is awful. I mean, he's great, but he just constantly tries to get you to talk about stuff that you said you didn't want to talk about when you were talking to the researcher. You know, and I was on one where he even asked me about Dominic Cummings and everything, which I thought, no, you must be joking. It's not what I do. I did say beware of just a chat. Just a chat. I have learned that, because then you have a long chat and there's one little tiny bit that gets, whoops, one tiny bit gets taken out. I pulled out my earplugs here. One tiny bit gets taken out and used in a story. And I'm particularly, I've become very unhappy about being used in news clips, because you give a long conversation and one tiny bit gets used. Number 6, we've heard about that from Kevin already, about the Christian Doston problem that we had. You know, controlling the nitpicking, we've already heard about that. You've got to be broad, controlling the jargon, getting a critical friend to comment on your performance. All these things are valuable as the performer. But the other thing is, you will get things wrong and make mistakes. And I made every mistake possible. Don't be shy about complaining. I've taken to complaining a lot, very loudly and very, you know, assertively, and if not angrily at times. So okay, I'll just talk about a few experiences. That's my manifesto, I suppose. Okay, one of the issues I've had is that I have done a lot of data analysis on COVID deaths, and for example, looking at the risk of dying if you catch it. And back in March, I was on More or Less and other places, because I have noted this, that the early estimates from Imperial about the risk of dying if you caught it were very similar to the normal annual risks we face just from normal life. They go along the same area, which would mean, roughly speaking, that if you catch the virus, it's like a year's worth of risk. That's why I said it's similar to the risk of dying this year from other causes. This got good coverage. BBC were excellent. Nick Triggle and others reproduced that graph and used it in a lot of their bulletins. But it was misinterpreted, and I blame myself for this, because people saw those dots lying along that line and thought, oh, well, it's the same, meaning it doesn't add to it, whereas actually it means it doubles the risk. And in particular, Katie Hopkins, bless her, while she was still on which counts as media, I think, while she was still on Twitter before she was thrown off, tweeted out to her 1 million followers that this means that corona deaths are not outpacing what is normal or usual. So complete misunderstanding, my bad communication for not putting the interpretation on the graph, something I now try to do every time. But then the Sun comes the headline, your risk of dying is no different this year despite coronavirus pandemic, says expert, me. Okay, so at this point, I have learned you immediately, I mean, Lucy didn't write that headline, it was a sub, wrote it, and to get onto the journalist and complain immediately saying you've got to change the headline. And I've done this again and again and again, had to have headlines changed. And generally, almost I think every time it's worked, it's happened. I've got to the stage with I've actually written the complaint to Ipso, but I've never actually sent it off. And so, you know, that's what it got changed to. It's not great, but it's better than it was. Okay, so this is why I emphasize that you know this is you've got to be an active participant in this business. What's interesting is that Imperial just did a new analysis based on 200,000 deaths. The first one was based on a diamond princess, and got this one now is almost exactly the same, even more reinforced that it's just about the same as the average risk of dying of something else this year. Okay, be careful speaking to the media. You know, yeah, you know, we've heard about the briefings and things like this, and I'll just, you know, I use this phrase of taking back control. This was interesting because I was asked onto the Andrew Marr show after I had all sorts of stuff in parliamentary questions being mentioned and things like that, due to a Guardian article I'd written and perhaps hadn't worded very well. And I did this Andrew Marr interview. You do them at 7 o'clock on the Sunday morning for broadcast at 10. And we did the interview, that was fine. And then I said, hang on, there's something I want to say. You haven't asked me something. So I said, ask me about what I think about the briefings. And so Andrew says, and I'll just show the clip because it is my one viral clip, you know, had 1.7 million views or something like this. So I'm going to show it, it's only a minute because I can't resist it. And I hope I've shared the sound.
They're now very familiar with these daily press briefings. How well are they working, do you think?
Well, I watched yesterday's, and frankly, I found it completely embarrassing. We get told lots of big numbers, imprecise numbers of tests being done, 96,878. Well, that's not how many were done yesterday. That includes people that were posted out, tests that were posted out. We're told 31,587 people have died. No, they haven't. It's far more than that. So
they're now very familiar with these daily press briefings. How well are they working?
Sorry.
Today, that includes people that were posted out, tests that were posted out. We're told 31,587 people have died. No, they haven't. It's far more than that. So I think this is, you know, actually not trustworthy communication of statistics. And it's such a missed opportunity. You know, there's a public out there who are broadly very supportive of the measures. They're hungry for details, for facts, for genuine information. And yet they get fed this, you know, what I call number theatre. Which seems to be coordinated really much more by, you know, a number 10 communications team rather than genuinely trying to inform people about what's going on. I just wish that the data was being brought together and presented by people who really knew its strengths and limitations and could treat the audience with some respect.
Okay, so what I wanted to illustrate by that was the fact that I took an initiative there. I wasn't just, you know, being, at the beck and call of the media. I actually did use that opportunity to say what I wanted to say, and I found this extra assertiveness that in a way, the popularity of expertise has been to be very gratifying. So just to finish off, my favourite media quote. One of what I regard as a real winner is that last week I was on the Today programme discussing possible Christmas rules, and I said that raised voices could spread the virus, and so maybe they might ban singing indoors, and also maybe a good idea to ban family arguments. And this got a good laugh. That was a joke. They thought this was a great idea, and that was in the morning. By 9:30 in the morning, I had that headline in the Daily Express. Families could be banned from arguing to prevent COVID spread, according to a leading British statistician. I thought, yes, what a result. So I was extremely proud of that. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And that's my little bit. And so what I'm going to do now is just go through the panel. And I've given perspective as a punter, you know, the statistician, and I'm so looking forward to hearing their viewpoints of how it's been working with statistics over the COVID time. So if we could start off with Stuart.
Great, thank you. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to join all of you today, and in this instance to participate on such an impressive panel following such great presentations. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint here, which don't seem to have it available as one of my options here. Am I a co-host so that I can share my screen?
Just give me a second. Which strange.
Right. Okay. Let me. No, I don't think there's anything I can do at this end.
I make you a co-host now.
Great. So that should mean that I can share. There we are.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay.
Right.
There's always a technical glitch somewhere along the line. Get it over with. There we are. Great. Thank you. So in my 10 minutes, I'm hoping to address two of the questions that Anne Schwen has set for us to think about, namely the major challenges to news reporting of the constantly changing flow of COVID-19 data and statistics, as he says, and also the extent to which news reporting of COVID data and statistics changes the hearts, minds, and helps to mobilize people to proper pandemic actions, which I think are suitably provocative for our purposes today. I'd like to begin with the observation that it is becoming increasingly apparent that tectonic shifts are reshaping the landscape of science journalism as the convergence of old and new media continues apace. Today's science journalist is increasingly expected to be multi-skilled in order to work comfortably across a range of digital platforms, while at the same time warding off the challenges posed by ordinary citizens, including the bloggers, the YouTubers, the TikTokers, let alone the self-described citizen science reporters, who are together threatening to storm the ramparts of the journalistic profession. Precisely how and to what extent new digital media are transforming science news is deserving of our close attention, as we've already heard today. Even those who are skeptical of celebratory pronouncements about the democratization of science need to recognize that alternative approaches to science reporting are flourishing online. For journalists willing to embrace new forms of connectivity with their publics, the quality of their insights is certain to be enriched, or not. Let's be perfectly clear that in an age of fake news and alternative facts and a post-truth era, the stakes are high. At a time when many newsrooms are under intense financial pressure to trim expenditure on specialist investigative reporting, it is all too often the case that science news is regarded as expendable. In the eyes of some, it is a luxury increasingly difficult to justify when certain other types of news will be both cheaper to produce and more popular with audiences, and thereby with advertisers. In recognizing that what counts as science news is being dramatically recast in the brave new world of the internet, however, we must not lose sight of our historical perspective. Fake news is not the invention of Donald Trump. By any measure, one of the most noteworthy controversies occurred in August 1835, when the New York Sun published a brief news item about, and I quote, some astronomical discoveries of the most wonderful description made by Sir John Herschel using, quote, an immense telescope of an entirely new purpose. To the astonishment of its readers and the chagrin of rival newspapers hurrying to republish the claims, the Sun explained how Herschel's telescope had caught a glimpse of, and I quote, continuous herds of brown quadrupeds having all the external characteristics of the bison, but more diminutive than any species of the Bos genus in our natural history, amongst other signs of life on the moon. A further installment described the topography of the moon's surface, including the most sensational revelation of all, namely that Herschel had observed furry winged men resembling bats, men and women, should say there. The ensuing frenzy engendered by the Sun's scoop went, we could say, viral around the globe, reaching Sir John Herschel himself in Cape Town, South Africa, who was extraordinarily irritated by all of this. What was being called the Great Moon Hoax was actually intended, according to the person who was penning these stories, Richard Adam Locke, as a satirical intervention his purpose, he insisted, and this is where I think it resonates for us today, is that he was seeking to demonstrate the gullibility of readers whose claims about astronomy were concerned. And again, I think worth noting for our purposes is the extent to which it was really the authenticity of the stories, that is the extent to which the Sun inflected the language of science in its reporting, which was credited with making the hoax so effective. It was this lent the discoveries an air of authenticity because of this kind of technical jargon, this kind of technical vocabulary. And at issue was the implied authority of ostensibly dispassionate scientific discourse, but also crucially the question of its very legitimacy in the eyes of diverse publics. Now we flash forward today to our own sort of digital publics, and we see that informing debates about the factual inaccuracies in news reports, wider concerns about the political economy of science journalism, the intense pressures constraining the repertorial work, journalistic perceptions of the relative authority of informational sources, and the general awareness of scientific concepts and principles are all crucial dimensions of warranting our attention, especially where questions of risk become controversial. And in addition to the list that David provided us with, you could add in pressures of sort of the hype space dilemma. That is, the more you hype a particular angle, the more space you're likely to be given to devote to it. Questions of journalism, that is to say, the extent to which journalism is over-reliant on press releases. Familiar debates about the embargo system and a whole host of other kinds of pressures which are constantly, well, certainly demand constant renegotiation. And I've been trying to kind of think these things through. I found myself somewhat surprisingly going back to the work of Ulrich Beck, the late Ulrich Beck, who passed away recently. And I would highly recommend to engage with Beck if you haven't done so already. And even if you have, trust me when I say that when you now reread Beck from the vantage point of the pandemic unfolding around us, it really does kind of bring to light a whole host of, for me at least, kind of intriguing insights which were almost kind of hidden in plain sight, previously. So much of what he has to say about the nature of the risk society sounds very, very differently from today's perspective. Very briefly, I mean, what Beck says is that to live in the risk society is to live in the hazardous age of creeping catastrophe, and that social debates are increasingly dominated by the dark sides of progress, and the riskiness of everyday life is becoming ever more apparent as uncertainties deepen. And here he's kind of drawing a contrast with industrial risks to kind of point out how nuclear, chemical, ecological, genetic engineering risks and the like are not limited in terms of time or space, are not accountable according to the established rules of causality, blame, and liability, and cannot be compensated or insured against. And the example he uses back when he was publishing this text a couple of decades ago was that in relation to Chernobyl, he was saying that years after the catastrophe, not even all of those injured by the incident are even born yet. And I think when we start to think through that kind of qualitative shift in the ways in which people are living with risk in the time of the pandemic, a lot of these issues come to light from a sort of fresh poignancy. And there are a number of scholars that have been developing Beck's ideas over the years, Phil McNaughton, John Urey, Ingrid Volkmar, and others, who kind of point to an interesting kind of paradox, and that is that just as the public awareness of the riskiness of the mundane aspects of daily life are intensifying, and that people are and there has been a growth in the sort of the degree of uncertainty that surrounds these risks, and people's sense of dependency upon the institutions and expertise responsible for managing and controlling these risks has grown. And here's the rub: at the same time, the degree of public trust in those institutions and in the expertise to manage risks effectively has diminished. And certainly in the risk society, science is not assumed to have a monopoly on truth. So for our purposes today, I just want to kind of very briefly, as I move to kind of wrap up, highlight a number of points here that I think warrant kind of rethinking a little bit in terms of trying to sort of get a better understanding of how risks can be changed, magnified, dramatized, minimized within knowledge, that they're open to social definition and construction, as we've already been hearing thus far in today's symposium, and that journalists are playing a crucial role in mediating the limits of risk. And as this process of mediation, as Beck sort of reminds us, the procedures for knowing the world and also for not knowing the world. And that part of it is a question of vocabulary, more to the point, the inadequacy of the current vocabulary we have to articulate these concerns. But also that this process of journalistic narrativization is kind of fraught with problems. Dispassionate facts must be marshaled into a balanced news story, ideally one with a discrete beginning, middle, and end, as well as with easily identifiable good versus evil conflicts. Again, speaking to the kind of news values that David was highlighting, that it's really a struggle to kind of narrativize the world. It's not straightforward in how to do it. And there are so many fissures, slips, gaps, and silences in this process of mediation that we need to really be attentive to. And we need to develop sort of a new form of self-reflexivity amongst journalists to help kind of denaturalize the ways in which media processes certain voices as being almost self-evidently expert or authoritative, while simultaneously framing others as lacking credibility. And it's this very self-evidentness, I'd suggest, that needs to be recognized as a site of discursive struggle. And as Beck talks about it in the case of risk conflicts, bureaucracies are suddenly unmasked and the alarmed public becomes aware of what they really are, forms of organized irresponsibility. And I think that, you know, when we think about Fox News and like, they're very easy targets, where that kind of sense of organized irresponsibility comes to the light in terms of how they are representing, or more to the point, misrepresenting scientific data. But at the same time, that doesn't leave everyone else off the hook. I think there is sort of a presumed assumption there often that facts effectively speak for themselves, and that scientific rationalities need to be challenged, and they need to be sort of opened up and interrogated in a way with sufficient transparency that it invites public confidence and trust. So just to end then, my last point is that a key point of departure, I think, for us in our discussions is that the taken for granted, seemingly commonsensical assumptions underpinning the media's preferred relations of definition are pivotal to the ways we as members of the public understand, negotiate, and challenge the uncertainties of today's risk society. And my very last kind of point there from Beck is that, in his words, the risk society can be grasped theoretically, empirically, and politically only if one starts from the premise that is always a knowledge, media, and information society at the same time, or often enough as well a society of non-knowledge and disinformation. So that kind of binary tension there, it's not clearly counterposed as a either or proposition, it's a question of emphasis, but one which we need to be increasingly aware of. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Sorry, God, so amateur. Yeah, thanks, Stuart, very much, and thanks for stopping sharing your screen. That's great. Can we go on to Paul? Paul, anything, whatever you wish to say.
Yes, happy to. Let me just share my screen. I'll try and present now. So yeah, I was just going to talk a little bit about uncertainty, and I think this year has really brought to a climax to some extent some trends that have been emerging in journalism more generally, and indeed more widely in I think in data circles. And it's a real problem for journalism, because in journalism we are trained to be concrete. This is a sentence from Strunk and White's book on the elements of style, which is a fantastic, very succinct book, and they express it very elegantly. The idea of using definite, specific, concrete language. So as journalists, systemically, we are trained we are culturally set up to be as concrete as possible. So when we're dealing with something like a pandemic where there's lots of uncertainty, then that really challenges that discipline. And in fact, as I said, this isn't a new thing. This is a graphic that was used by the New York Times at the 2016 election to represent what polls were saying at the time about who was predicted to win. And we know at the time that Hillary Clinton was relatively, strongly predicted to win. And so there was a bit of concern about how those polls could have got it wrong. But actually this gauge was, it was a device, it was a narrative device. It wasn't accurately portraying specific uncertainty, if you like. It was just trying to give audiences an indication that what they were reading about or what they were seeing was not an accurate, specific number. Clinton wasn't this amount ahead of Trump. It was, within a certain margin, this is what we think, or this is what the polls tell us about the election. And people hated it. It really, generated a lot of an emotional reaction, because people do like concreteness. They don't like uncertainty. So, and actually the New York Times learned a lot from that process in terms of how they could represent uncertainty in a way that worked with audiences that would be effective. And they adjusted that over the years, and it came back this year. And of course, we've seen similar sorts of techniques tried with the R number, for example. This is John Byrne-Murdoch at the Financial Times, who's obviously done a lot of work around coronavirus, and his attempt to represent actually two different R numbers. So coming back to the point that we were talking about, or was being talked about earlier, that there's not necessarily a single R number. So that's also acknowledging that this R number is just one of a number of models. We've seen, this is an example from the US in different states, so trying to represent that this is a range, it's not a specific number. And of course, we've got modeling in terms of predicting what's going to happen next, how cases might change. It might be how cases might change in response to particular political interventions or policies. This was an animation on 538 trying to illustrate different models of how the virus might develop. And again, you've still got margins here. Now, one of the tensions we have as journalists, I think, is, first of all, we need to use forms that are clear for audiences. We need to, for example, scatter plots were mentioned earlier as something which audiences may not be able to understand, certainly as quickly as other chart types. One of the challenges we have is when we use these sorts of visualizations, we have to be confident that our audience is, if you like, literate in these charts and able to understand them. But we also have a role in teaching our audiences to be familiar with these. We're not just communicators, we actually create new ways of telling stories. So that's part of the tension we're dealing with. Interactivity offers some really interesting possibilities here. This is an example of a story which allows the user to interact with different models and play different models out. And I think that really engages the user in a deeper experience, which is different to just passively seeing a chart. And in fact, I think there's not enough being done around interactivity in terms of how we can use that to educate and help people to understand uncertainty, for example. And this is one example of animation and interactivity being used to demonstrate or explain how false positives and false negatives work. Again, I think it's quite an effective medium, if you like, that we're only just starting to explore. But one of the problems we have institutionally is that, there are lots of devices, there are lots of types of charts we can use to show uncertainty, but they're generally not in the content management system of news organizations. You won't see plots like these I would confidently say that maybe the FT, but probably no news organisation actually allows journalists to create these charts. You'd have to go outside of a content management system, create it externally, and then either take a screenshot of it or link to it. So you get problems like this. These are a couple of stories reporting the various, if you like, risks of for different ethnicities and age groups. Actually, this is the original data it's based on a visualization by the ONS, which again is trying to show that this is not a single number, but it's within a range. So you can see, for example, that the Indian group overlaps with other and overlaps with Bangladeshi and Pakistani and overlaps with black. In fact, it overlaps with everything. So you can't confidently say that that group is at greater risk or a higher likelihood of dying than anyone else. Now, there is some positive developments here. Quite recently, the Broadcast Journalism Training Council, I was talking to them about how they could make sure that new journalists, trainee journalists on the courses that they accredit, are required to have numeracy. It seems insane that we're very, very sharp on spelling and grammar and things like that, and that will be in the requirements. But we actually, until recently, haven't required trainee journalists to know this. But this now is in the BJTC's accreditation documents. If you're running a course that's accredited by the Broadcast Journalism Training Council, you do have to demonstrate that you're teaching basic kind of statistical literacy. And the other good news, I think, is that again, we've had another election this year and more uncertainty around that. And actually elections are really good for pushing news organisations to consider how they deal with and communicate uncertainty. This is one particular way that one news outlet tried to communicate that by putting different models alongside each other, talking about, around 5 in 6 chance, those sorts of things. I think that's also helping us deal with this way of communicating uncertainty. And of course, our audiences are getting used to it as well. So perhaps as journalists, we're going to be more confident about not knowing an exact number to tell about. One final point on that, I think there's enormous potential for inviting the audience to tell us what they think first before we reveal the numbers. And this is You Draw It, which is another New York Times genre, if you like. It's a type of article that they do where they present half the chart and then the audience is invited to draw what they think happens next in that chart before they're told the actual answer. The nice thing about this is that this it brings us into the process and hopefully allows us to kind of acknowledge that we're wrong without necessarily admitting it completely. So I think, again, those forms of interactivity offer some really interesting opportunities going forward. That's it.
Great. Paul, thank you very much indeed for doing that and sharing your screen. And so now I'm going to go over to Tom. And so if you put, yeah, that's right. Right, fine. Tom, I don't know if you want to show some slides.
I do not. I feel very inadequate. I feel completely outgunned by my lack of...
Just perform, just do it. Just sing a song.
I know. Oh God, I should have done this amazing high-tech wizardry stuff, but no. Okay, so I'm just going to talk. So one thing I've noticed is we keep being told during the pandemic that there's been this sort of really high stakes, high speed lesson for the population in statistical literacy. We've all learning these things about case fatality rates versus infection fatality rates and R and false positives and Bayes and everything. And I think there's an element of truth in that. But also what it's been is a real sort of short, sharp education in the pitfalls of all these things. I think Kevin mentioned both of the examples I'm going to use in his speech, but I'm going to just blunder on through anyway. But the R value was a really a case in point here. Everyone sort of got everyone got the hang of this idea that if R above 1 is exponential growth, R below 1 the disease dies away, and you can sort of think, okay, here we've got a nice straightforward simple number. Above 1 is bad, below 1 is good. And then there was this great series of headlines during the lockdown. Let me see if I can bring up the thing about when it went up again, and everyone had this mad panic of sort of, oh god, suddenly headlines in the Mail and headlines all over the place about this is going to be, R's gone back up above 1, is the disease spreading again, all that sort of stuff. And it turned out what had happened was this. It was an example of Simpson's paradox. What was happening was there were 2 separate epidemics going on in the in care homes and hospitals versus the population at large, and because it had gone down in both of them, but because of this weird, complicated sort of statistical paradox called Simpson's paradox, it actually, the numbers looked like it was going up overall. And so even though the epidemic was at that particular point dying away, because of this sort of complicated thing, it looked like it was going up. I would try and explain Simpson's paradox without graphs on the thing here. Is just not worth the effort, so I'm not going to give it a try. And this, I felt, was a really sort of a sort of nice, simple, a nice example of how there's always an extra layer of complexity. You can teach. It looks like it's nice and straightforward. We've all got this sort of example of how it's going up, but actually there is a there's another layer that you can get to that you're unaware of. And because I'm a journalist, I haven't got a background in maths, haven't got a background in science. From university, I did philosophy. I'm one of the humanities grads that everyone sort of mocks, and that's left me with this idea that I'm not super confident about statistics. So I go into everything with a basic attitude that everything's probably more complicated than it seems. And this, I think, is a sort of attitude that serves journalists really well. Like, if you think you've got the hang of it, you probably haven't. And it's worth. And this is why I think the relationship between journalists and statisticians and journalists and scientists and experts in general is really important, because in my work, what I find is if I think I understand something, then I phone up Kevin or David and say, "Can you explain this to me?" And they'll say, "No, it's more complicated than that. You've misunderstood X, and it's really important that you sort of you gather these things." And so I think that is, this sort of really go for journalists. It's absolutely vital we go into all of these sort of more complex technical subjects with a real sort of air of humility. There's going to be stuff that I don't understand. I haven't spent a career researching this. It is really vital that we go and speak to the people who know it. And you could really see this with that R example I just gave, but also when the false positive stuff was coming out, when there was that sort of, I almost don't want to name the names, but Julia Hartley-Brewer and Toby Young and people were sort of saying, look, there's this number, false positives. If false positives at this rate and the actual prevalence in the population is this rate, then that means that 91% of positives are false, and therefore 91% of the epidemic isn't real, or something like that. And well, no, that's not how it works. But you've got hold of one simple fact and glommed on from there to this sort of wider thing. And if you'd just gone and talked calmly to a few experts and sort of had them talk you through it, you would have realized that there was more to it than that. So I think it's really vital that as journalists we go into it all with a sort of sense of humility and an understanding there is probably, given that we have not spent a career studying whatever particular thing we are writing about that week, there's probably more to it than that, and should put more trust in experts and build relationships with experts. On the subject of relationships between journalists and statisticians and scientists and experts in general, which David was talking about, I feel there are, it's vital for us. It is as journalists, certainly as specialist science journalists or anything like that, we can't do our jobs without those relationships. For statisticians and for scientists, as David was saying, there are pitfalls, right? Because David can talk to me for 25 minutes and then he'll say as an off, I really don't like journalists, and then I put that as my headline. That's my thing. I can nick out of it. So I think there are a couple of things there that statisticians and experts can be really wary of. And I think firstly, one thing that you guys need to be statisticians as experts need to be really careful of is you can't say at the end of the conversation this was all off the record. Arrange that beforehand. Okay, that's actually, it's something that people don't talk about, and I think they see Hollywood things and then people saying, so by the way, off the record X. off the record is something you have to agree between the two of you. So just be aware of that. A way around that, which is really important, is building long-term relationships. Again, I've just written a book about stats in the news with my cousin David. It's coming out in March, all good bookshops, etc., etc. And I relied really heavily on partly my cousin who's an economist, but also on Kevin McConway, who really helpfully gave us loads of his time to check our working and turned one chapter from garbled nonsense into something that approaching correct. And I rely on him utterly. And so if I were to now go, if ever sometime I go and speak to him and then misrepresent something he says and ruin that relationship, that's just, from my point of view, a terrible thing. It would ruin a sort of resource for me for future use. Okay, so it's a really good idea as experts, as statisticians, as scientists, whoever, to go and build these relationships so that there is an incentive for journalists not to use your words as a sort of gotcha headline and that sort of thing. That is a really good and sensible and wise thing to do. And also there's a human thing. I don't want to basically stab my friends in the back by doing unpleasant things and using them. So I think that is a really vital thing for you, for you. And when I say us, I mean journalists. When I say you, I mean statisticians, scientists. And while we're on this, of sort of things that statisticians and scientists can do that's really useful for journalists, I think there's a really useful thing, which actually the Science Media Centre is really as a really useful resource for, and I think is actually the key thing that Science Media Centre does, and which I think scientists and statisticians in general can be great at, is telling us what things don't mean. So if you have a press release comes out and press release says, I don't know, eating fish fingers correlates with snoring, something like that. I don't know. You can, the percentage of fish fingers goes up X, and what the statistician can tell you, what the expert can tell you, is that this doesn't mean that fish fingers necessarily cause snoring. And you can say this is a this is a correlational study, this is an observational study. It is not an RCT. We cannot be sure of causality. And if you tell a journalist this doesn't mean X causes Y, then they'll be much less likely to write the mistaken headline. This, or hopefully they can tell their sub-editors not to do it. This doesn't mean the fish fingers cause snoring. There is more to it than that. There could be some third factor, etc., etc. It's also worth being really explicit about contexts. So I know this is a real point that David goes on about an awful lot, and it is really important. Absolute versus relative risk. I think it is, if you say your risk of having birth defects or something, if you're a father over 50, goes up by 33%. It's really important to explain to people what this 33% of what, so if it goes up from 0.1 to 0.133, you might not care all that much. And as Paul was just talking about a moment ago, the uncertainty intervals are another crucial thing. I was looking at for my book about the predictions for the growth in the economy this year, and the heavily reporting that the estimate forecasted to grow 1.9% or something like that this year, and then so that's recorded. But what they didn't say was that the uncertainty interval was between like -1 and +6%, and so your headline is never going to be the economy might shrink a bit, or it might grow quite a lot, or anything in between this year. We don't know. But if you make that really clear to people, they will find it harder to then just sort of glom onto this really simple point estimate that will the certain thing in the middle, because that is always going to be misleading. And then, of course, this year it turned out there was a gigantic pandemic, and it was nowhere. It fell well outside the 95% uncertainty interval anyway. So, and I suppose you might say, and you'd be reasonable to say, that journalists should be doing this anyway, because we are the ones transmitting the knowledge. But a lot of us don't have that specialist knowledge, and even the ones who might or do, the scientific specialists, a lot of them aren't lucky like me and can write one column a week and then spend the rest of the time sort of pontificating, thinking about things. Often they're writing 5 stories a day, because the sort of financial situation in journalism is so constrained these days. There's just so much time pressure. And the incentives are often to churn things out as quickly as possible, and that is not ideal, but it's how it is. People think journalists don't care about truth, but they often do. It's just that the incentives to tell the truth are not brilliantly aligned with the incentives to gather readership and get work done and get stuff out. That's not always true, and there is a subset of journalists, I think, who do just loudly misunderstand things for clicks, and I think we can all think of a few of them. But on the whole, we are trying to get things right, and I think the relationship between scientists and journalists, statisticians and journalists, is really vital for helping us to do that. You'd think I'd have some neat thought to tie that all up, but I haven't, so I'm just going to end there. Hello, thank you.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, it's a lot of ideas that we could come back to, but before we do, I'd like to pass over to Pamela, and she could tell us what's the thinking.
Thank you very much.
What's the thinking from the Guardian?
I would never say that I represented the thinking of the Guardian. I think that would be definitely overstating my importance there. No, I'm going to put on a timer, because when I timed this for this presentation last night, it went to 17 minutes. I'm going to try not to do that again.
Bit much.
Bit much, yeah. So my name is Pamela Duncan. I am a data journalist with The Guardian. Our data projects team is a small team of 3 people who you be forgiven for thinking that we were all Irish, but actually it's 2 and 1, just 2/3 Irish. But we're a very small team, and ordinarily in the time before COVID, our role within The Guardian was very different. We do like obviously data analysis and things, but a lot of our time was spent doing kind of explorative work, using coding to kind of tell stories in innovative and using innovative approaches to find new ways into stories. Do a lot of collaborations with correspondents to give, because we are generalists with data skills, whereas the correspondents have their beat and they understand it really well. Work a lot with graphics and investigations, outside collaborations, but most of our stuff was medium and a long-term focus. And we also spent part of our time teaching and training the journalists within the newsroom, which actually I think is really important, both in skills and statistics, but also kind of showing what we do as a team. Then, along came COVID and everything very much changed. And one of the first things that we noticed was just how much our knowledge was being drawn upon by the newsroom. And apparently this was a broader trend, because when my colleague and boss, Keenan Barr, was asked to go on BBC Radio 4 in May, they introduced her thus, and John Byrne Murdoch was on the same show. But 3 months ago, if you'd met someone at a party and they told you you're a data journalist, you might have moved swiftly on. Today, data journalists have become the rock stars of the news business. Now, we always knew that we were rock stars, but we were glad to see other people acknowledging it. Unfortunately, during COVID, that kind of went maybe too far. The news desk, all of a sudden, instead of looking for us maybe, twice or 3 times a week for news stories between the 3 of us, were coming to us almost every day to give some indication of how busy we've been in the last 8 months. I've worked in The Guardian for 5 years. It was my anniversary last month. And in that time, I've written 338 stories. When I looked last night, I realized that 1/3 of those have been since March. And of those 112 stories, 106 have been about COVID, most of them about death. So just like the sheer volume of data that has come out, and the skill set that we have and need to apply nowadays, it's just it has been quite overwhelming. At the same time, our audience developed an appetite for statistics. And as other people have mentioned here, that appetite doesn't necessarily have come with data literacy. So we have in turn kind of acted, both data journalists and science journalists have acted as translators for the science community and for statisticians to try and get like all of this kind of myriad of numbers across to readers in a way that they can understand. And also because data literacy isn't kind of implicit in the, within the newsroom. I mean, a lot of journalists kind of feel that they should feel like they're nearly allergic to numbers. I know I used to be like that. And so you also have to translate it for your colleagues and for the news desk. The trouble with this, and I'll get into this a bit more, is that too many figures confuses far more than it illuminates. And statistics, as every statistician here will know, are nuanced. And that's very hard to put across in a very short news story. So the first thing we noticed very, very early on was that there were major holes in the data. Now, we appreciate that everybody was just like a headless chicken for the first month. Nobody had it was completely unprecedented. And so, you know, there was a bit of give and take. But after about a month, we were sort of thinking, well, surely these statistics now. Very early on, we wasn't always a story, but what was missing. Best example of this being the government's early figures on the number of COVID deaths, which neglected to include for a very long time deaths in care homes, which of course became a huge part of the COVID narrative. And we were calling this out quite early. The other thing was, and I do appreciate that the government as death count even now is a really useful indicator because they can collect these numbers very quickly. But it also posed a challenge to us because we knew that the statistical agencies were producing the better figures, but how did we explain this big hole to our readers? And it's something that we're still struggling with, to be honest. We also find problems with how the government were presenting the figures. We, like David Spiegelhalter, found the daily briefings to be at times quite just frustrating to watch. Like, unreliable it was to, you know, compare countries' death tolls when different countries were counting their deaths in such different ways. So here we pointed to the case of like how Belgium were including care home deaths and the UK were not, among other things. There were also there's also real life implications of data errors. So you might recall this story where almost 16,000 coronavirus cases were not included in the official tally because they were being kept in an Excel spreadsheet and the Excel spreadsheet ran out of space. We're data journalists, right? Like, we're not, you know, we love Excel, but we were also kind of screaming inside thinking like, why would you keep this in an Excel sheet? You will run out of space. And this has real life implications because as a result of those cases being missed, an estimated 50,000 contacts were missed. And last week, there was a report by Alex Hearn saying that 1,500 deaths might have been avoided had it not been for that statistical anomaly. Data errors also give fuel to those who say COVID deaths are exaggerated. So Peter Hitchens, who's a Mail on Sunday columnist, I think, tweeted this about one of our stories when the government revised down its death toll for very good reason, because of the anomaly of the kind of, if you ever died of COVID, you could be if you ever had COVID, you could be included in the government's death toll. And that was a loophole that needed to be closed off. But it does give people the opportunity to then play down the actual statistics, and I find that like quite frustrating as well. So how hard can it be to count deaths? Well, surprisingly hard, I think, is the answer to that question, and not one that I would have kind of guessed at the start of this pandemic. So we identified at the very beginning, we thought, look, we're going to use deaths here, not cases. We didn't have great hospitalization figures at the time, not detailed enough for what we were trying to achieve. So we decided the deaths were the best metric. We identified that the statistical bodies had the best count, but there was a time lag of, a week and a half, depending on the agency. Scotland is better. We discovered, well, we knew this before, but it really became apparent during this pandemic that this is not the United Kingdom of data. At one point, we were collecting our data from the DHSE, PHE, the NHSE, the ONS, NRS, and NISRA, all on different days at different times. I mean, it was just a scheduling nightmare trying to figure it out. That has improved with the government API. And then we've got COVID deaths versus excess deaths. And I noticed in the chat that statisticians are rightly saying that excess deaths should be the gold standard, and it is, and especially for international comparison. But you're also, as a data journalist, competing with, like all these other organizations are marking milestones. So for example, this week we marked, yesterday there was the government official death toll hit 60,000. But 2 days previous to that, the statistical agencies combined with the more recent deaths hit 75,000. So I've written 2 articles this week that are 15,000 deaths apart, and we're like trying to explain this all the time. But you can understand why this has led to confusion and pushback from our readers. And I'm going to give you one example of that. So this was the earlier death toll when the statistical agency's total brought us to 60,000, which was in late October. And I was really surprised because given that we've been writing these stories and explaining the difference between the two things for the last 8 months now, that we got a lot of reader complaints about this story. And the quote from one of them was, "The author mentions that the quoted death toll of 61,000 includes all deaths that mention COVID on a death certificate, which is a discredited method of counting data deaths." Now, I'm sure the ONS and their counterparts would not consider their method of counting deaths discredited, but I do think that it demonstrates the confusion that all of these various numbers can lead to. I'm already over time, so I'm just going to try and run through this one. But the positives are that the statistical agencies themselves have all been solid, transparent, and helpful wherever they can be, despite like massive pressure. Call out to Sarah Call from the ONS, who just takes my calls and is so pleasant week on week. The PI, which I believe is maintained by Public Health England, is a vast improvement on what went before and has allowed us to automate some of the processes and kind of free up more of our time for the analysis instead of us like just trying to like pull together all these strands of data. The scientific community, and I'm not just blowing smoke up your bums, but you've all been so generous with your time and so patient in your explanation. Big shout out to the Science Media Centre, who have been incredible. I think I'm hoping that this pandemic will lead to increased data awareness among the public, but I do think we also have a responsibility there, although I'm not quite sure that it's a teaching one. It's more kind of maybe something to do along the lines of, standardization of how we explain things. And also data journalists and statisticians have gone from geeks to rock stars.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Pamela. I never thought I'd never be put in that category, but never mind. A bit old, but never better late than never. Jane, we would love to hear your comments.
Hi, I'm going to keep my comments here quite brief because obviously I've got a presentation later on where I'm talking lots about uncertainty. But I just want to pick up on some of the things that both Pamela and Tom were saying. And say, I agree with Pamela that in the beginning we were all floundering around looking at this data and wondering what on earth to do with it. And we also just had to accept the data we were given by the government, which was, arriving in a really ad hoc fashion. The data for England didn't match the data, the UK-wide data once you added up England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And, it's just really, really complicated. So I would say, we've learned a huge amount since the beginning of the pandemic in how to put all this data together and how to deal with the uncertainty in the statistics. And I just want to stress, how important this relationship is between journalists and scientists. David, you mentioned the Science Media Centre and how wonderful it is. And I would just echo that really. I think we'd be completely lost without them. Like Tom, I'm a humanities graduate. I don't pretend to be a mathematician or a statistician. I've got, great support at PA from data experts, but really I'm looking to the scientists to help me unravel what all this data means, and, asking you to help provide a simple message for the public, and to cut through some of the noise there and, deal with some of the way the data has become really politicized. So we're very much reliant on the Science Media Centre. And just another thing you were saying, David, was that you've become a bit of a complainer. And I would say, you know, we welcome complaints. I don't know any journalist that wants to include things that are inaccurate and just allow it to sit there in your copy. We definitely welcome complaints, and I would spread the message around your fellows that actually that's something that they should be doing too. And one of the points that Tom was making about absolute and relative risk, I want to take this opportunity to just say, yes, please. It's something that we've always grappled with. It's something we can never pin down very well. And we do get loads of complaints about, you know, talking about 50% increased risk of something, but we can't accurately say from what to what. And it's often not in the academic research paper either. So I think there's quite a lot of work there that scientists could be doing to help us communicate in that way, in actually providing the absolute risk. I noticed one of the questions in the chat box was about social media. Now at PA, we have a whole team whose entire job, full-time jobs, are to go through social media looking for things. I don't think it's anything that any specialist news reporter or general news reporter anywhere can spend their whole time looking at Twitter. And it brings me back to talking about how, you know, how important this relationship is between individual journalists and scientists, that they trust. We don't have time to go through Twitter, so we are looking to the scientists that we've used before, that we have been really reliable before, that are known to the Science Media Centre, and that we can turn to give us some analysis on what is going on, really. And I think another thing you were saying, David, was about preprints. Now, I know from just looking back at my own career that this kind of thing was only ever found in obscure scientific conferences in America, where you would go off, speak to a bunch of researchers who were looking at something quite interesting, write up a reasonably short story and say, you know, this hasn't been peer reviewed and it's been presented at a conference, but what's happened with the pandemic is that huge amounts of papers are now preprints, haven't been peer reviewed. And the fact is that we can't ignore them. As journalists, we can't ignore them. We have to be writing these stories. We have to be writing them really quickly. And so again, we are turning to scientists to help us unravel whether at first glance this data looks any good, what the story means, and whether it's reliable enough to get the message out there. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Jane, thank you very much indeed. Okay, thank you all for your comments, which have been extraordinary. I want to start off by asking some questions of anyone who would like to stick their hand up and answer, because we've heard about the major changes that have happened, and whether it's about preprints, whether it's about the relationships between journalists and scientists, and the sort of symbiotic relationship that's been required to really help each other along, and whether it's the attitude of the media outlets and the public to data, and this demand for numbers and their interpretation, I suppose. And that's happened. But of course, you know, the cavalry's come over the hill, in Boris's words. We're all going to get our vaccine. Well, I'm going to get it before any of you, I think. And so we're going to be, you know, saved in the future, although there will be some long, you know, low-running endemic presence in the community. What do you think are the long-term impacts of these massive, you know, structural changes that have happened over the last 8 months, both in, I suppose, yeah, in the media coverage relationship with statistics and numbers in particular, science in general perhaps, but statistics and numbers in particular. So anyone want to comment about what they think might be downstream in a year's time, 2 years maybe? What changes do you think might have happened?
Go for that if you like.
Yeah, Tom.
All right. Okay. Well, we're caveating it. We'll talk about uncertainty and everything with the major caveat that I haven't got a clue, and obviously we don't know, and it's a year in the future, and so on and so forth. My own instinct with all these things, you know, it's like all the big societal changes. everyone's going to, we all, you know, everyone's suddenly working from home. Will that still be the case in a year? I mean, my own guess would be probably there'll be more working from home, but it'll still be, most things will be back to largely how they were, with this sort of greater awareness that you can work from home and it doesn't ruin everything. And I suspect it will be kind of a similar setup here. People will, this demand for numbers is quite context specific. People want to know what the R value is because it affects their lives right now, and they want to know how many, you know, deaths per day and all these things because it matters right now. In a year's time, when it is not so current, they'll want to know the same things they did before about, you know, weather reports and football scores and all the stuff that affects their lives that day. Then I would be I'd be very surprised if in 18 months or a year or whatever, when we're out of this, we're suddenly a population of 70 million amateur statisticians still. I think that, you know, this interest in all this stuff is very and understandably context specific. I don't know, that'd be my guess anyway.
Okay, any other, has anybody else got anything? I mean, I feel really guilty because one of my big arguments with the media throughout this whole thing is that I'm always being asked to either blame somebody or speculate about what might happen, neither of which I want to do. So I'm asking you to speculate now. Stuart, speculate away.
Okay, well, I'll take two speculations. I guess I'm erring on the side of optimism here. I think one of them, maybe a year or so from down the way, we will all have learned to live with complexity to a greater extent. Several of our speakers in this panel have highlighted the contingencies of uncertainty. And I'd like to think that if we work hard enough along these lines, that we can encourage and invite that sense of being able to appreciate that a lot of this reporting is actually difficult to do. And I think a journalism that's honest about its own limitations and makes transparent its struggle to kind of narrativize these kinds of conflicting discourses can really play a powerful role in terms of making members of the public kind of aware of the messiness of science.
Yeah.
And that's not a bad thing. That's just how science works. I think that could be really important. I'd also, and here I am really sort of erring on the side of optimism, like to think that somewhere along the line, we're going to begin to recognize collectively that good quality reporting is expensive and someone has to pay for it, starting with members of the public. And if we could get that across too, that would, you know, recognizing that so much of the nonsense that's out there, the disinformation, the rubbish really, could be cleared away with a growing recognition that people are going to have to actually, you know, put their hand in their pocket and say, you know what, I need to actually help underwrite the cost of good journalism, and I'm going to have to start actually paying for it, in addition to what the BBC and other groups are doing. So I'd like to kind of think that we're moving in that direction.
Oh, it's great to hear some optimism there. Jane, are you optimistic too?
I'm hoping that there is a lasting change in newsrooms, really, and that the importance of having a specialist team remains, and that actually, if anything, these specialist teams need to be beefed up, and that the data journalists who, before the pandemic, may have sat in an obscure room somewhere and nobody really knew what they were doing, that their importance is recognised, and that you know, there is a continued investment both in health and science reporters and data specialists working in newsrooms. I think that would be a brilliant lasting effect of the pandemic in news.
That would be excellent indeed. You know, to see that profile. Pamela, what do you feel? Yeah.
Sorry, I would definitely agree with Jen. Like, I do think journalism does need more. We do need to generally to be, I think, better resourced. We're not kind of, you know, the obscure statisticians in the room. We're journalists who have the skills to be able to translate data and statistics. But I also think that within, like, reporters more generally need to have a better understanding of statistics, so that, you know, we're not relied upon when something like this comes about. That there needs to be greater data literacy across newsrooms.
If I can, I'll add a sceptical note, which is that I think I would have hoped that as well. But I guess what I'm seeing in the news industry is that already some data journalist roles are being cut. So the BBC has cut or chopped the head off 2 of its data teams. On the plus side, the data journalists that remain are being integrated into other newsrooms in a way that could have a cultural knock-on effect. But I think generally, you know, the lack of money, the loss of money in the industry, so the bigger impact of the coronavirus, of the pandemic, has been a loss of commercial income. Well, that will probably have a bigger impact on the amount of journalists and the resources than the fact that we all know that we need them. On the plus side, I think, you know, journalists are generalists, and they have to be able to turn their hand to lots of different things and pick up lots of different knowledge. And what the last, you know, 6 months, 9 months has done is forced a lot of journalists to swat up. So non-data journalists have had to really get to grips with these things in ways that they had no reason to necessarily before. So they will carry that knowledge forward, and they will have built relationships with and contacts with inside the news organisation with data journalists. So they'll know that Pamela exists, they'll know that I exist, you know, they'll know that Jane exists. And they'll have built contacts outside with scientists and statisticians. So I think all of that is probably the more positive thing. I'm more sceptical about whether we will have more of the journalists that we need that can deal with it.
Pamela.
There's been a lot of optimism knocking around, so I'm going to inject a negative, which is that, like, I do fear that that because there's so much confusion around data and numbers that maybe in a way we're also like there is a chance that we're also kind of like adding to that sense of kind of confusion and frustration among our audience. And you know, increasingly in you know, in the wider world, you're hearing stuff like, you know, you're hearing like anti-vax sentiment, or you're hearing I mean, or like COVID is a hoax, you know what I mean? To hear this from like people who in some cases can be very close to you is quite disconcerting. And I fear that, like, if, you know, there is such misinformation, and I know that that's the point of this symposium, and I hope that that's something that's teased out across the course of the day, is how do we counteract as you know, people of facts and stats, and how do we counteract this kind of anti-mainstream media, anti-expert narrative? And you know, the thing is, for me, sometimes it's like, somebody alluded to this earlier on, like I might know who my audience are, but what I don't know is who my audience aren't, and who isn't getting this information, and what misinformation is floating around. So I suppose that's my fear for the next, you know, fear for the next year.
Could I actually come back to that point? I think it is so important, because I get you know, bombarded with emails from what I call the skeptical wing, Yeadon supporters and all this would be, and often, you know, there's a point in what they're saying, but you know, it's all sort of mixed up, and it's using statistics, and they're picking and choosing, etc., etc. And I find it, I have been quoted as really supporting that group, as being in that group, because of being quite vocal in criticism of a lot of the government announcements and the quality of the data and so on. And this seems to come back to what Pamela says, is this, you know, what is a reasonable critique of the data and the numbers and things like that, and a reasonable sort of discussion of the range of genuine scientific uncertainty and disagreement, which then can, you know, can actually support what you might call at the further end of the when it starts going into misinformation, and support those groups, and then can be used as evidence for how you can't believe anything and you can't rely on anything at all. And this has happened to me. And I'm just wondering, you know, which Pamela's raised about this, what responsibility one has to try to counter that misinformation at the same time as being, you know, clear that actually there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot that isn't very good, and we can't trust all the data and so on. And I'm just wondering how people feel that we could try to negotiate that delicate balance.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's really interesting for journalists now is just how aware we are of how people receive journalism. So we know now that simply reporting the facts is not enough. People don't believe the facts, and we laboured under that illusion for a century or more. So one of the things we're grappling with at the moment is how do we report the facts in a way that people are actually going to believe it? You've got, you know, various evidence about how people respond to that, confirmation bias and so on. And likewise, there's a lot of research going on around misinformation, disinformation, fact checking. What is the right way to fact check and address that? To some extent, that in some cases you can actually reinforce misinformation by reporting on it, even if you're fact checking it. So you know, I think we're discovering as we go. There's a lot of work being done on which approaches are most effective, when to actually fact check something and when to ignore it, because actually you're just going to make the problem worse. So I think it will get better.
I mean, I'm butting in here because I'm a real fan of the work by my colleagues here in Cambridge and elsewhere on pre-bunking, or actually preempting misinformation and getting in there fast to inoculate people against it. But I feel there is some good evidence on that. Are there any other comments?
Sorry, David, we have 10 minutes for audience questions.
Okay,
so,
I'll move over to questions from the audience.
Yep.
Somebody's asked about the government communications, whether they're, you know, in their charts and statistics that they're using, are they controlling the narrative through that? And again, I'd like to know how you respond to either, you know, maybe things that you feel haven't been done well in terms of the government communication, without, it comes back, you know, a similar thing, without actually saying it's all wrong. How do you manage to deal with that? Do you think the government's been effective at it?
If I could, like, you know, I think that at the beginning, as you know, as Jane and I both said, like everybody was just, we were all run around like headless chickens. Like it was just an incredibly confusing time. And I actually do feel that at the start, like especially with the likes of, you know, NHS England, everybody was on the same side. We were all trying to get this information out, but it was all just so chaotic, and we were all dealing with working from home and like that change. And also, you know, like all the personal stuff that came with it. So like, so I think that at the beginning that there was a lot of goodwill, but fairly early on, I mean, you know, like it's very difficult. It's nearly, I wouldn't like to be so cynical as to say like the government like deliberately set out to only like count hospital deaths or what have you, because it was so hectic at the beginning. But at the same time, you have to kind of think, well, of course, it suits the government to have like the smaller death figure out in the international domain, because then they're not getting headlines saying the UK is the worst in Europe, the UK is the worst in the world, and you know this persistence with the statistics. I mean, the kind of the smaller number that the government put out versus the larger statistical agencies' death numbers. I mean, you know, at some point you kind of got to think, well, we've had time now to be able to like manage so that we kind of find a better balance between the two. And yeah, you do kind of wonder how, like, if this sort of level of confusion actually benefits, like, because you know, by there being so much confusion, then you're like, if people are sort of like, well, we don't really know where it is, let's just, I don't know, watch I'm a Celebrity, get me out of here instead, then is that like of advantage to them? I know I'm striking a cynical tone, but these are questions that I've been asking myself on and off over the course of the pandemic, and I don't necessarily know where the answer lies. But all I can say from my perspective as a data journalist, trying to get to the truth of it, trying to get to the nub of it, is it's very frustrating.
Yeah. I mean, I gave some evidence to the parliamentary inquiry, and I said about some of the graphs, I didn't want to accuse anybody of anything deliberate misinformation, but I said, were somebody wanting to manipulate people's emotions, this is the kind of thing they might have done, which I hope sort of got me out of that. Are there any more comments on that? Or I'd like to actually go with another question from Alison Bailey about social media. We're running out of time now, but I would like to know about what people feel has been the role of social media, how this is, you know, it's impossible to say, and the counterfactual, had there been no social media, how might the response of the mainstream media have been different? how much has it been influenced by social media and how much is it influencing social media, I guess. Yeah. Anybody want to comment on that?
Okay, so it's again, it's sort of very, very vague thoughts, but I mean, it makes it different rather than making it better or worse, is my sort of experience anyway. It's like there is a tendency for mad nonsense to go viral, but there's also a tendency for, certainly when God knows, whenever I write anything whenever the thing that's been on my mind recently is about the vaccine, and I've been writing a lot about the vaccine, and every single time I write a thing about vaccine, I get the words vaccine and virus mixed up, and within 30 seconds of me publishing the piece, someone will have told me that I've got the words virus and vaccine mixed up. There's this really vital fact-checking role that social media does, which is incredibly quick feedback on everything you do, and whether people realize it doesn't really matter that I get virus and vaccine mixed up, but it does matter when I get case fatality rates mixed up with infection fatality rates or something like that, and I make some and that
false negatives and false positives. That's what everyone gets.
Exactly. No, exactly. So sensitivity and specificity, whatever. And I get, of course, I get these things wrong because I'm writing quickly, being edited quickly by non-specialists. It's these are going to get mistakes, then they're going to have mistakes, and then they're going to be read by some professor of maths at Bristol University who can point out the errors, and that is fantastic, and it makes everything better. So my own instinct is that would have been very different, but there would also, there would have been less nonsense spread around the internet in weird little sort of enclaves of misinformation, but also there'd be much less much less impact on news outlets that get things wrong, because there's no, apart from letters to the editor, there's not really a feedback system that tells them when they've screwed up, and people tell me I've screwed up all the time, and it's brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Jane, what do you feel?
I would, obviously there's a lot of nonsense on social media, but for me, because I work at a breaking news agency, it can also be just enormously helpful. In the past, before Twitter, you could put a call into the Department of Health asking for a comment on something, and you would wait 8 hours to get a response. In fact, you do still often wait 8 hours to get a response. But now, you've got Boris Johnson tweeting, Matt Hancock, all the people I need in a lead story on say, the Pfizer vaccine announcement. And it's just there, it's immediate. It goes up on PA within seconds, and I can pull it all into a story, within minutes, really. So in terms of a breaking news perspective, social media can be enormously helpful.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap up now, and thank you all, the panel, very much. I'd love to just gossip with you for ages, because I want to find out about all the inside stories about what's been going on. But never mind, we'll have to keep that for another time when we can sit around having a drink. So I'd really like to thank Tom and Stuart and Pamela and Jane and Paul for giving up their time and for contributing to this session, which I found incredibly useful and valuable. And I hope the audience has too. So I'm going to pass back to Anne now, who will presumably tell us what's going to happen next.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. We take a 5-minute break, and then we go back to the next section, which is on science, journalism, and politics, which is basically a continuation of what we've been in the panel. Okay, so there will be 3 presentations, and so please go and grab a coffee and then come back in 5 minutes.